How does learning work? Learning theories in a nutshell. Learning is a human phenomenon. Among other things, being a human means that you will learn something new every single day. It is so naturalized that usually we do not stop to think about how does learning work. But imagine that at some point an extraterrestrial arrives in the Earth and you are forced to explain this learning process to him. What would you do? I would start saying to him that usually humans learn in two main ways, formally and informally. While the informal learning happens all the time in our lives, the formal part of it had been designated to a particular institution, the school. Schools are these amazing places where adults, also known as teachers, interact with children and adolescents, also known as students, to make sure they learn part of the knowledge humankind had developed throughout its existence. Great idea, right? The problem is, the learning process is more complicated than only bringing together adults and kids and sharing information. Indeed, since we decided to create schools, the way we understand how learning works had changed enormously. Because humans are really organized, they systematize their ideas into theories. Focusing in our friend's interest, we would have to present him learning theories, which are important ways to organize ideas and practice about learning and teaching. They also influence teachers' decisions and have direct implications on how and what children and adolescents learn. Learning theories describe how learning process occurs, namely, how do we connect the knowledge and the knower. Some are more influential than the others, and some had long-lasting effects in schooling. Let's give our extraterrestrial a tour through the most influential learning theories and their implications for learning and teaching during the last century. By the beginning of the 20th century, the training learning theory was the behaviorism. The underlying assumption of this theory is that learning occurs through behavioral change. The classic behaviorism was influenced by some important scholars, such as Pavlov, John Watson, and Skinner. In common, most of these authors started their studies looking at animals. Yes, that's precisely what you hear. They studied how animals reacted to a specific stimulus to learn a new behavior. The core idea of this theory is that learning occurs when the learner receives an incentive and gives a response. Translating from the mouse's cage to the classroom, teachers should create a series of stimulus, from praising students' correct answers to giving them rewards, such as grades, stars, prizes, etc. Indeed, punishment was also interpreted as a behavioral stimulus. Then, for example, the students would deliver their assignments not because they want to be praised, but because they don't want to be punished. A sister theory of behaviorism is the connectionism. His father, Edward Thorndike, also based his findings on studies with animals, but he differed from his behaviorist peers in two major ways. First, instead of looking only at behavioral changes, he was also interested in mental processes. Second, he focused on self-directed behaviors. The theory is called connectionism because the animals in the study established connections between a particular stimulus, the problem of getting food, and a self-initiated behavior, hungry. Regarding learning, that means that problem solving involves establishing associations or connections between the stimulus and appropriate responses. Teachers, therefore, should create learning environments in which students would form connections that will be mobilized later. Thorndike's theory based his explanations heavily on behavioral change, but he also included references to mental processes. These two theories were totally fine to explain the acquisition of declarative knowledge. Particularly when it comes to memorization and recalling, it seems that the stimulus response framework works well, right? But much about the internal learning process remain unanswered. What are the internal processes, the cognitive moves that learning triggers? Do students really absorb knowledge like sponges, or do they interact and build their own knowledge? These questions were at the center of the theoretical branch that we call constructivism. Jean Piaget was one of the first psychologists to focus his interest on the cognitive development of children, as opposed to the behaviorists that were looking at the outside stimuli. Piaget was interested in what goes inside children's head. More specifically, he was concerned about how children construct mental representations of the world in a very complex process of development. A very influential aspect of his theory was the definition of stages of development for children. In the sensory-motor stage, which goes from born to 2 years old, the infant is exploring the world mainly through sensory and motor contact. They are primarily developing the idea of separation and permanence. The next stage, that goes up to 6 years, is called pre-operational. At that stage, children start using symbols such as words or images to represent objects, but they do not reason logically. This is also called the egocentric stage. The concrete operational stage goes from 7 to 12 years old. It is when the children start thinking logically about concrete objects and to understand conservation. The final stage, the formal operation, is when the adolescent can reason abstractly and think in hypothetical terms. Piagetian constructivism had a considerable impact on teaching and learning. When compared to behaviorist theories, it added some fundamental aspects, particularly the fact that learning was not seen as a behavioral, but a cognitive change. Nevertheless, it was limited because this approach saw children's development as a linear and straightforward process. Moreover, it did not account for social and contextual aspects of learning. The socio-constructivism tackled these two aspects. The primary influence of this theoretical branch was the Russian Lev Vygotsky. Among other things, Vygotsky did not believe that learning was separated from its social context. According to him, cognitive functions originate in and must be explained as products of social interaction. When one is learning, he or she is being integrated into a knowledge community. Therefore, language and culture are at the center of the learning process, since they are the means for interaction and learning. We can say that language and culture are the frameworks through which human beings experience, communicate, and understand the world. Vygotsky did not propose boxes to divide developmental stages for children. Rather, he asserted that the learning process was the permanent movement through two different levels of development. The level of actual development is the development level that the learner already reached, a level in which the learner is capable of solving problems independently. The level in which the learner is capable of achieving under the guidance of teachers or in collaboration with their colleagues is called the level of potential development. The distance between what students can do autonomously and their potential development is called zone of proximal development. To move through these zones, students need scaffolds. They need tools to help them navigate this distance and become more and more independent. A learning environment organized according to this theory would allow for plenty of social interaction between students, with teachers acting as mediators between what students know and what they are capable of knowing. Teachers must be able to select the appropriate scaffolds, understand who the students are, and which type of help do students need to learn. A closed theory is the situated cognition. Like socio-constructivism, this theory asserts that it is impossible to separate knowledge from the context or situation in which it was acquired. That is to say, that learning is connected to a culture, place, activity, or social situation. As one can imagine, social interaction plays an essential role here. But what makes this theory different is how it sheds light on the doing aspect of learning. If we assume that knowledge is situated, we may expect schools to teach students by creating a situation in which they experience as authentic learning as possible. Moreover, they must learn within communities of learning, in which learner brings her own knowledge and perception to the world to increase the group's socially constructed understanding. Well, this looks like an overwhelming presentation for our extraterrestrial friend, right? Most likely, by the end of this introduction, he would ask us, by the end of the day, which learning theories should teachers follow? How do you guys educate our kids now? Unfortunately, there is no single answer for these questions. If I were the guy though, I would say that if we want to offer our children equitable opportunities to develop as autonomous citizens, critical thinkers, and individuals that can continue learning from the situations they are experiencing in their lives, we should organize a curriculum and select learning experiences that draw on socio-constructivist and situated cognition theories. This curriculum should focus on learning with understanding, identifying the core aspects of disciplines, their big ideas, and provide intellectual tools that students need to transfer the learning to new situations. This classroom should offer students opportunities to work in depth around problems that are authentic, as close as possible to challenges they will face in the real world. They must be able to explore their ideas, share their reasonings with their peers, and collectively advance through their zones of proximal development. The teachers would mediate social interactions, work as facilitators, building the bridge to students reach their own understandings. If this school is possible, we still need to explore. Nevertheless, a century of studies gave us the intellectual tools to start planning and changing our classrooms in that directions. How about started